So it is about a minute till the start time. Elizabeth Berger. Elizabeth, you want to give a wave?
Hello.
Elizabeth Berger is our moderator and admin person. So she's going to be letting people in and muting you if you are talking. And that is just going to be so that we can get a really clear recording. Well, first of all, I just want to say welcome. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the what I call the Big TADA for 2023. We are going to be looking at some amazing portfolios. I'm going to talk a little bit about what Stitching Towards Discovery is in the slideshow, but right now I just want to say this group of quilters joined on in January to do this whole journey together, and everyone is at a different place in their quilt making journey, and you'll see that in the slideshow, but you also see just the incredible work they did and the progress they made. And I think you'll also notice, at least I have, it doesn't matter where you start. If you're willing to commit time to being in front of your sewing machine and thinking about your work, amazing things can happen. And really, that's the big story here. Okay, so recording has been started. I'm going to pull up the slideshow. The other thing I should say is that students have worked very hard. They've sent me their slides. I've put them in order. We've done all this formatting. And the bottom line is, if there are any mistakes, they're mine. And I apologize both to the presenters and to the viewers if I anything, if I failed to format something correctly. Okay, here we go. The workshop is called Stitching Towards Discovery, and this, which is our final event, and it is the presentation of portfolios, it is called the Big TADA. Elizabeth, who I just introduced you to, is our moderator, and she will be monitoring the chat. She will not be interrupting any of the presenters, but she will try and answer your questions in the chat. And if you can keep yourself muted, that would be great. She will be muting you also as if you forget. Okay. I want to say, which is kind of fun to say, is that Dippy Dyes is a sponsor of this event. And to tell you a little bit about Dippy Dyes, it is a dyeing company essentially owned and operated by professional dyer Lisa Reber. And you can go to her website at dippydyes.com. She has yardage that she has dyed using a variety of techniques for sale. You can also custom order dyed fabric from her. She has a color card, which you can request, and then you can order yardage. And I have done both.
I would imagine, I mean, you're going to have.
But my favorite thing is that she has a subscription service, and her subscription service, every month you get one color in 5 values. So say it's tomato red, you're going to get a very light version, a medium light, a medium dark, and a dark. And you can decide whether you want 1 yard cuts or 3 yard cuts of each of that you want to receive every month. I get the 3 yard cuts. So every month I get a delicious color in 5 values, and it's super fun. Elizabeth's going to be putting this information about Lisa Reber and Dippy Dyes into the chat. It'll also be in the show notes after we post this show on the YouTube channel. Okay, so next, it's a couple of what I call PSAs, public service announcements. I'll try and keep these be pretty quick. Next week, I am part of Piecing Palooza, which is a super fun event that is sponsored by Creative Spark, which is part of CNT Publishing. And I'm going to be talking about how to do pieced pinwheel blocks made out of strip sets, and some really cool effects that you can get, basically taking strips and cutting them into triangles. If you use my code, which Elizabeth will also put in the show notes and in the chat, you can get $20 off from the event. It's 4 hours. You can attend live or you can just watch it later, but it is, I want to say 12 to 16 different teachers talking about different things related to piecing. So it's a very cool event. I teach a couple of different types of virtual format classes, and these classes are offered by me, with Elizabeth being my moderator and assistant. And obviously I teach at festivals and venues and other places, but I have these virtual classes that I teach, and there are a couple of formats, and I'll just talk about the format as we talk about the class. So the next 4-session format class that's coming up is in July. It's called Big Botany. It's a fan favorite. People love this class, and the quilts that come out of it are mind-bogglingly good. What we do is we work from a botanical image. Everybody has their own image. We flatten it out to have a 2D perspective, and then we work on building palettes and piecework that represents each area of the botanical image. It's a really amazing class, and there is space, and you can sign up on my website and my Instagram feed. Occasionally, basically once a year, I do what I'm calling Improv for Everyone. And this year, the Improv for Everyone is just a 4-hour class. It gives you a chance to sort of check me out as a teacher and maybe learn something new about improvisational piecing. It's a very easy on the wallet class. The class is $30. You get the recording, and we're going to be talking about pods. This particular quilt is by Carol Johnson Fritz, and the pod is this shape here. And you will be amazed at all the things that you can do with that shape. And we're going to talk about as many of them as possible in a 4-hour session. You'll be stitching along with me, and we'll do some show and tell and all that good stuff. So if you're interested in that, that's also on my Instagram and my website. And then for the main event, we're going to talk about, I have 2 slides here really describing what Stitching Toward Discovery is. And it is a 6-month-long seminar for students to actively work on new quilts and develop their own quilt aesthetic. Students are expected to complete a series of tasks that will empower them to do the following. So these are the goals of the class. 1 is to create a small body of work. 4 to 6 large wall quilts is my suggestion. It is also about creating a sustainable quilt making practice through goal setting and accountability in our Facebook community. So we have a private Facebook page where people share what they're working on and discuss, the lectures and different topics that we cover during the 6-month period. And then the last thing is to improve their ability to speak and present their work in a semi-public setting, which is what this is. So that's kind of what Stitching Towards Discovery is. And then this is more of a how is it structured. So sign up, it's open for sign up now. I'm only taking 24 students. And we meet twice a month. Well, before we start meeting, you actually do a one-on-one consult with me where I meet with you on Zoom, and we kind of talk about what your expectations are, any questions you may have, all that kind of good stuff. Then we start meeting in June, and we meet twice a month. Typically, there will be, because I also travel a bit, it is roughly twice a month, and there'll be the 2 sessions for each month. One of them is a formal session, and that session features a guest lecturer. It will be an announcement of the month's prompts, which I'll talk a little bit more about in just a second. And then we do what I call student consults or feedback sessions. And then in the second session, which is the informal session, so I call it the study group, we have a happy hour where you may or may not be drinking tasty beverages, but the idea is to just get together and talk about what's happening in our quilting world. So that might be a discussion about QuiltCon. It might be a discussion about what tools we use for pressing. Some people may find this conversation boring, but if you are passionate about quilting, I think you'll probably enjoy it. It's probably my favorite part, is that hour we just get together and chat. And then I do a lecture during the study group session, and then we do more feedback and student consults. Each student has 2 private consults. One happens at the beginning of class and one happens at the end when we're getting ready for our presentations. All sessions are recorded and made available to students until the end of the year. And these are some of our lecture topics: goal setting, working in a series, design and composition, entering shows, and the artistic process. And some of our speakers from this year, we heard from Lisa Call, Susan Lapham, Irene Roderick, and Jane Dunwald. We also had a panel discussion about entering shows. And then the prompts, which are really kind of cool. So what a prompt is, some of you may be familiar with the word, some of you may not. It is usually a 1-word suggestion from which you leap off and make a quilt in response to that suggestion. So every month there are 4 options. And of course, you could do all 4, you could do 1, you could save them for a rainy day. The 4 things are: 1 is the wild card, or random, which is just usually something I'm thinking about, and I'm curious what folks would do if they were given it as a prompt. 1 prompt is formal design. So within that prompt, we will discuss design elements, and you will focus on one of them if you choose to use that as your prompt. So it might be monochromatic, it might be line. There's a lot of different design elements, and that's the prompt that covers that. Under the influence is a prompt related to typically a relatively famous artist. And that gives you an opportunity to expand your artistic knowledge, learn more about other artists and what they do in other mediums, and maybe be inspired by how they use color or shape or line, and then have a conversation with their work by creating a work that is inspired by their work. And then the last one is a lyrical or visual prompt. I think fences was one of the visual prompts, solstice was one of them. So it's just usually a word that there is a visual connected to, and you can respond to that with making a quilt. And the last, let's see, what else is there here? So we have a private Facebook group. It's just for the people that are in Stitching Towards Discovery. We are going to start an alumni group, and that is going to be pretty exciting, I think. And then the way we end the workshop is with the Big TADA, which is what you are joining us for right now. I want to go back one slide. In the Big TADA, each student will speak for approximately 3 to 5 minutes about who they are, what work they've created, and maybe share a little bit with us about what they're going to do next. I am advancing the slides, and the artist, the quilt maker, will be talking, except for I think 2 individuals who could not attend live, and I will be speaking on their behalf. All right. Those of you who've taken classes with me before know I like to start with a quote. So here's today's quote. Nothing in the world can take the place of persistence. Talent will not. Nothing is more common than unsuccessful men with talent. Genius will not. Unrewarded genius is almost a proverb. Education will not. The world is full of educated derelicts. Persistence and determination alone are omnipotent. And that's what I saw over and over with these students and their willingness just to do the work. And what happens when you do the work is you get really good, and you're going to see that. So I would like to present 19 students' work in what we call the Big TADA. And we're going to start with Cindy.
Okay, you got me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. My name is Cindy Bartle. I live in Aurora, Ontario, which is just north of Toronto in Canada. For almost 30 years, I've been a quilter looking for that perfect 1/4 inch seam and perfect point. I've always loved color, but my quilting satisfaction was getting static. I was in a total improv vacuum when I met Maria Shell in 2021. Next slide. This was my first adventure into improv, both the cutting and the design. It was part of Maria's on the grid workshop. All I could see in my grid were the masts and the booms of the sailboats I grew up with. Improv cutting, I quickly learned, was a technique I wanted to explore further. This quilt, I matchstick quilted on my domestic machine. Next slide. Bow Seat was the result of Maria's Under the Influence workshop in November 22. It was this workshop that the switch flipped, that I could produce art and not just sew wall hangings. We were asked to examine what influenced us as artists. For me, it was the Canadian Group of 7, the wilderness of Ontario, and the canoes that my kids loved to paddle there. I loved how this turned out with a blend of both exacting precision and improv piecing. A pattern of freezer paper templates were made for the canoe ribs. Next slide. Maria challenged us with a new prompt every month. This quilt answered a 12 color palette challenge and the use of a repeated shape. There were a lot of partial and Y seams in this, a true exercise in patience. My husband walked in, looked at my design wall and said, "Boy, that'll keep you awake." Hence, insomnia was born. I saw Melissa is one of the viewers, and Melissa, I used one of your suggestions for the quilting pattern of this. Next slide, please. A monochromatic prompt sparked the design of this purple tree. It sat on my design wall for a couple of months while I played with various piece backgrounds. Nothing seemed to work. But then I found an ombre fabric in my stash and the meditation of Ojibwe writer, Richard Wegemus. It all came together, a challenge to piece, but ended up being a very special work. A portion of that meditation read is, quote, "Against the sky, the trees raise crooked fingers in praise. To be here is to be affected, made more, filled. The creative energy of the universe. Drink it in, my friends." End quote. A special friend has purchased this work. Next slide. Another month, the prompt was the art of noticing. For me, it was turtles, especially the painted turtles of Ontario. It was a fun challenge as this piece was designed from the outside in and again stretched some of my piecing skills, especially the insert circles. Next slide, please. One of our monthly speakers challenged us to do a work in a series. So pleased with Turtle 1 and researching the blanding turtle, a turtle threatened in Ontario with territory all the way down to South Dakota, my second turtle wall hanging was made. Again, a mix of precision and improv piecing. The ideas for turtles 3 and 4 are already starting to percolate. Next slide, please. We were challenged to occasionally make ourselves design rules to help focus the design process. This wall hanging resulted from 9 orphaned 1/4 log cabin blocks that I had in my stash. I challenged myself for the initial design step, just to slash and sew them in squares. I loved how this came together during one snowy weekend in March. I enjoyed the process so much that I knew I wanted to expand the design and color palette in another work. Next slide, please. Thinking oceans and waves, this piece was initially designed on the horizontal, a spontaneous rotation of 90 degrees, and something wonderful happened. The waves became trees with the dappled light of the forest floor, one of my favorite places. The circles are hand knotted in tie-dyed cotton. This will be a fun one to quilt. These past 6 months have been a supportive, challenging, and inspirational exercise. It has prompted me to listen to my emerging inner voice and given me permission to just make art, enjoy the process, and not worry where the final product might end up. So thank you, Maria. Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you to those who encouraged me at home, and thank you to my fellow workshop partners. I enjoyed watching your processes and creativity, and I learned a lot.
Hi, my name's Jane Beatty. I live in Northern California near San Francisco. I've been quilting for over 30 years, mostly riffing on patterns and more recently postings I see online from quilters that I follow. But I want to make my own unique work. So for the past year, I've been doing a deep dive into improv piecing. I want to bring a sense of movement into my quilt designs. I thought this would require using lots of flowing curves, almost like a Baroque artwork. But Maria has helped me find a way to bring that energy into my work with my current skill set. Next slide. This is a good example of my improv style when the workshop began. I'm very comfortable making fractured log cabins. I made it in response to the monochromatic prompt that Maria sent us as a warm-up. But I couldn't resist adding some shots of orange to my blues because, as Vincent van Gogh said, there is no blue without orange. Next slide. I made this one for the repeated shapes with the 12 color palette prompt. I'm trying to bring movement in with the curves, and I use the pieced strips on the arc to make your eye move around the quilt. And although I wasn't setting out to mimic Henri Matisse, it does remind me a lot of his Fauvis paintings. Next slide. I took Maria's circle and curve class to try to get more confidence with curves. And I did learn a lot in the class, but I think that the staggered dotted lines do a lot to liven up this quilt. Next slide. One of the great things about this workshop is the artists that Maria introduces you to. Exploring their work online has been very inspiring, even the ones I thought I already knew. I made this quilt in response to the Hilda Auf Klimt prompt. I'm using both her pastel palette and her organic shapes. And conquering these pod shapes was a big victory for me. And it's one of my favorite quilt tops from the workshop. It has a very serene feel that I really enjoy. Next slide. This is in response to the Bauhaus prompt. I really focused in on Annie Albers's weavings, and she had just wonderful pieces, but instead of using her natural palette, I went with the more traditional primary palette the Bauhaus used. I cut the strips freehand to give it more of a woven feel. Next slide. I call this quilt Finding My Rhythm because it was my breakthrough quilt. I realized I don't need curves to bring movement into my quilts. What I want is rhythm. And I can get this energy with repeated yet varying elements and using a vibrant palette to really reinforce the rhythm. Maria pointed out when we were going over my work in the final consult that I use a lot of dotted lines in my work. So I've been subconsciously using these to bring rhythm into my quilts all along. And this workshop has helped grow my confidence and imagination as an artist. We're a very vibrant community of quilters collectively pursuing and sharing our inspirations. My husband looked at my quilts yesterday and he said, "You couldn't have done this 6 months ago." I'm going to continue taking classes to grow as an artist, both with Maria and other instructors. And I have 2 week-long workshops, in-person workshops scheduled for later this year. My long-term goal is to be brave enough to enter a quilt in QuiltCon in the next few years. And like Cindy, I want to thank Maria and Elizabeth and all the other quilters in this group for this last 6 months. It has just been magical. And I know part of it is just the sitting down and repeatedly coming in to do the work, but the other is the community that has really, really helped me grow as an artist. And I just want to thank everyone. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Kate Brown. I started quilting about 5 years ago when my family moved to Ohio. Because I'm a fairly new quilter with a background in literature rather than art or sewing, my approach has been to set myself a challenge and then just see what happens. So a course called Stitching Toward Discovery really appealed to me. One thing I learned quickly is that I hadn't been experimenting with color. As you can see in this photo, everything I made was green. Next slide. And this is what happened when I started working with Maria. This quilt is called Matrix, along with the next 2 quilts. It responds to Lauren Groff's novel of that title. The 3 Matrix quilts have an overlapping palette, but they each presented different construction challenges. In this quilt, the 12 wedges had to come evenly together to form the central shape. And then that shape had to be set on a diagonal in order for the inner stars to align as I wished them to. Next slide. This quilt too is a response to Matrix, but it was also inspired by the class prompt Winter Solstice. This was by far my most challenging project. The star is composed of 8 45-degree triangles, which were pieced together before adding the background rays. I started by paper piecing, but kept changing the design and the palette to make the star feel more wintry and distant. We have kind of hard winters in Cleveland, Ohio. And as a result, the construction became ever more ad hoc. It's still not perfect, but I think that imperfections will quilt out.
I'm ready to be seen again. Visit mytopetha.com to find a PED eye specialist and to see.
Should I unmute? Okay. This third matrix quilt is called Cataract Nights. It moves away from the ruler-based piecing of the previous quilts, and I experimented instead with improvisational shapes, especially circles and asymmetrical composition. Most of the units here started as leftovers from the previous 2 quilts. Putting it all together was like figuring out a jigsaw puzzle, and it was really fun. Next. So the next 3 quilts all explore the graphic possibilities of letters. One of the class prompts asked, what would you look like if you were a quilt? And mine, of course, had to be green. The letters in this quilt do mean something. Each row spells out one of my names, which together summarize my personal history. But I wanted them to be largely absorbed into the overall design so that the viewer's initial experience was visual rather than readerly. But I will read it. It says, Catherine, Elizabeth, Rivka, Elisheva, Brown, Halberstam. Next. This quilt I made in honor of my father, my late father. The color palette is inspired by a Clifford Still painting, which I really admire because it uses bubblegum pink very beautifully. Here, the letters are not legible. I did start with the letters of my father's name, but I combined and altered them to create a sort of otherworldly alphabet, with each character striving to offer a gateway across the silence of loss. I honestly think my dad would be completely mystified by this quilt, and he would also love it. Next. Now, this is my last quilt. In it, both figure and ground are entirely pieced. There's like hundreds of pieces there. And this was one of my goals, to create my own fabric and then cut into it. My other goal was to explore color interaction. I wanted to see whether I could make colors I don't really like, the greenish golds of the moon, become more compelling through their interaction with a complementary background. The phrase in the moon reads, "Thus with the year, seasons return," which is the opening line of my favorite passage from Paradise Lost. So among the very, very many things I've learned from this class is that I love the invitation it offers to enjoy the process of discovering new ideas and techniques, especially in the company of other people who also like discovering. And I'm sure I will be back for more next year. In fact, after the show, I'm signing up for Stitching for Discovery 2024. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Leanna Butcher, and I live in Snohomish, Washington, which is just north of Seattle. I've only been quilting for the last 2 years, so I decided to take Stitching Towards Discovery to apply what I've learned to create my own original compositions and to put myself onto the path to finding my quilting voice. And no rulers were used in the making of these quilt tops. Circus tents and UFOs started in Maria's Circle and Curve Sampler class last fall, but I didn't have the skills to complete it until this year. I learned a lot about sewing curves, and the bright colors I chose, along with the flowing borders and big wedge circles I created, reminded me of old-time circus tents and wagons, while the funky eyeball shapes became UFOs. This quilt is the result of taking Maria's Under the Influence class last November, and I finished the top in January this year. I was struck by the lovely contrast between the dark, wet dirt and the bright fall leaves in my garden, and I used that as my inspiration. It was a ton of fun abstracting the leaves and the dirt, although using that much black and brown was definitely out of my comfort zone. I took the solstice prompt and decided to compose my quilt using half rectangle triangles. Say that fast 5 times. It's a shape I've never used before and one I'd like to keep exploring. This quilt was created so you can flip the orientation to either the winter or the summer solstice. The inspiration for this piece came from hearing Blondie's Heart of Glass song on the car radio in March. The image I had of a heart made of shards of glass was intriguing, so I challenged myself to make it into a quilt. I'm really happy with the way it turned out, and there might be a series in here somewhere, but I'm still thinking about that. Lastly, this quilt top is based on the place prompt and is my impression of the amazing California super bloom that happened in Ventura in April. This piece pushed my skill set to a whole new level, and I'm not going to lie, I had a mini panic attack cutting the hole in the sky to inset that sun, but I took the leap, and I'm glad that I did. I'm looking forward to taking what I've learned about quilting and myself as an artist over the last 6 months to keep making work, keep pushing myself, and as I continue to develop my voice. Thank you to Maria, to Elizabeth, and everyone in the class for the inspiration, for sharing your work, and for such a terrific learning experience.
Hi, my name is Gail Code. I live in Amherst, New Hampshire, which is in the south of the state near Nashua. I have sewed since I was a kid, but only got serious about quilts and piecing in about 2016, and I joined the local New Hampshire Modern Quilt Guild. I worked at building my skill set and ultimately realized that I especially liked and was good at improvisational work after classes and projects with Tara Fonin, Nick Ball, and Maria Schell. My goal in participating in the Stitching to Discovery workshop was to build and expand my improvisational piecing and design skills. This quilt top is a carryover from my work in Maria's Big Botany class. Technically, it was challenging for me. It is an evocative depiction of a spruce tree growing in an abandoned granite quarry on Deer Isle, Maine, facing out to the forest, bays, islands, ocean, and with the sky above. It is based on a picture. We have a summer place on Deer Isle, and I feel like I have very successfully conveyed the feeling of being at the quarry and looking out to the oceans and islands. My second quilt responded to Maria's prompt of Corita Kent, an artist who made several paintings of the Wonder Bread package, which some of you may remember from your childhood, with circles in bright primary colors. To execute this, I developed my own method of machine sewing the inset circles, which lay beautifully and reliably flat. Following Corita's lead, I used bright primary colors, which were very cheering to work with. I also realized that all single color circles were going to be boring, so I added layers to a number of them. My third quilt continues the circles theme and my piecing methodology, but applies it to an abstract flower garden scene. As you can see, I experimented with a large sunflower, which was inset in one piece, setting spokes in the set of flowers on the left top, and then below successfully piecing in the pink flowers on top of the leaves and background, again using my method. I again conquered some significant construction issues, including trying to get the leaves to overlap each other, and I'm very pleased with the final result. My final quilt, which I've labeled Connections, is my effort to follow Irene Roderick's methods of improv as described in her book, Dancing with the Wall. I started by developing a pull of fabrics, and then I pieced the fabric into various shapes and designs based in part on ideas in Irene's book. Not all of them made it into the final version. I decided to largely focus on straight lines and squares and limited the size of the top early on so I could get it done before we had this presentation. to close, I just would also like to thank Maria and everyone in this group for introducing us to lots of new ideas and quilters, broadening our skills and quilting potential. This was a terrific learning experience and I recommend it highly. And who knows, I may be back with Maria next January as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maureen Garner, and I just want to say that I have been so thankful for this experience and working with my fellow artists and the growth that I've achieved during this time. And one thing that Maria said at the beginning, maybe the first or second class, is she read a poem that compared, it was written by a poet that compared, obviously a poem written by a poet, but anyway, that compared typers versus poets and quilters versus artists. And that's something that really stuck with me throughout this whole 6-month process. Am I a quilter? Am I an artist? Am I a quilt artist? And I think that you will see my evolution as an artist as we go through my presentation. And I just, before we go to the next slide, I just want you to notice the colors in the quilt behind me are very rainbow bright. And that's going to play into, and Maria, you can change to the next slide, what I'm going to talk about. My biggest focus through the past 6 months has been on color. And so I was very rainbow bright in every quilt I did and all my approaches. And so for this prompt, it was shaped using Maria's process for a 12 color palette. And so I intentionally brought in colors that I would never use, colors that were muddier, colors that were less vibrant, and put them up with colors that I would normally use. And it became a whole exploration in color for me. And I think it really ended up being a very interesting piece. One of the things that I really found interesting is that you can manipulate the flow and the movement by changing the angle of the triangles and the size and even the shape of the triangles to add flow. And then in this quilt, it was monochromatic, was the prompt for it. And I wanted to do something very different. So I decided to, the concept was to do these rings like you see here, but to break through the rings with a continuous color, whether it would be in the same color or the same value as you see throughout. But with my monochromatic, I started with 6 shades of green and soon realized I needed more green. So I ended up using everything that I had in my stash. Then I ended up buying more green. So I couldn't even tell you how many different shades of green are in this, but I can say I do have the largest stash of green solid fabrics in the nation. But the one thing is I really noticed that I needed to add some other color to break it up. And so that's where the purple and the blue came in to work with the green. And I think it made a really interesting composition. So I also took the Circle and Curves class with Maria in March, and I knew I wanted to use the piece from that class as one of my portfolio pieces. And I, again, explored color in here. And this time it was using kind of more analogous colors of the same value, and then using, that is a bright green, it's a yellow green, it looks more yellow in here, and a dark brown, which looks black, but using that with the white as pop of colors to see what kind of texture and movement and what could it create. And this was made with braided curves, but also a lot of what Maria calls controlled curves, where you're deciding which way the curve is going to go as you're making it. And she had the suggestion to include the wavy, curvy stripes and triangles that I had had in my previous compositions, just to pull it all together. So that's what I did. So this is where my creative journey took a huge turn in a different direction. I consider myself an improv quilter, but I do have roots in traditional quilting, and I really love the modern traditionalist aesthetic. So I had this vintage quilt that I inherited from my mother-in-law, and I really wanted to do something with it. And so I decided to explode the block from kind of an 8-inch block to a 22-inch block. And in doing that, I discovered there's these 5 center on-point squares that could be used to do a variety of different designs, kind of endless designs with it. And while everything in here is ruler cut, the process was very improv oriented. I mean, I didn't decide on what was going to go in the center or what were the colors that were going to be used or how I was going to handle it all until I was at the design wall. So it really gave me an opportunity to expand color again and looking at bright colors and how colors can play off of each other, looking at complementary versus analogous and seeing what I could do. As I was working on it, I realized this would make a fantastic pattern. So I've actually designed a pattern that should be coming out in July for this quilt. And this is where it all comes together. When I did the Neptune star, I knew I wanted to make just a single large one and make it totally improv. This was also an exploration in color. For example, some of the center square colors are carried out into the chevron diamonds. Some of the reds and pinks in the orange and yellow squares are carried out into the star points. But I wanted to see how can I push color but still make it look, include different colors, but still make it look interesting and still being able to pull all of the different colors together. So this has been, like I said at the beginning, an exciting journey for me. I think the biggest thing is that I have grown so much in my confidence. I have answered my question about whether or not I'm a quilter and an artist, and I have decided I am a quilt artist. And that has actually been huge for me. I know some of my friends are watching tonight, and we've had many a conversation about what Maureen was. So they'll be glad to hear I've decided I'm an artist. And I've decided that I can work in both improv and modern traditional quilting. And what's next for me is I hope to be teaching. I quit my job, so I'm hoping that quilting can give me a little bit of supplemental income. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Margaret Grottenthaler. I'm an art quilter from Toronto, Canada. Tulips hang out with some daisies to discuss the color pink is, I think, a good example of the techniques I like to combine. Like many of my pieces, it started with a drawing, which I use as a guide, but not a pattern. I have a bit of a kitchen sink approach to quilting. So you see the background is improvised piecing. The tablecloth is foundation paper piecing. The vases are improvised as separate pieces and appliqued to the background. The flowers are rayon applique. There's a bit of silk organza in there to create the shading, and it's all topped off with machine and hand embroidery, and has free motion and walking foot quilting to finish it off. Inspiration can come from many places, including hotel bathrooms. This Hotel Kepler was inspired by a Paris hotel that was decorated entirely in a Viennese secessionist style. I made many drawings before I settled on the design. I created a foundation paper piecing to replicate the ribbon effect of the bathroom wallpaper. That is in the top left. And I created an FPP pattern for the floor part as well. The rest is improvised. Again, the vases are appliqued onto the background, and I used pony silk and the metallic fabrics to replicate to represent the luxury of that period of design. Again, a bathroom inspiration. We're redecorating in our bathroom, and I have to say goodbye to my set of Missoni towels. So in recognition of their long service to the family, I made this quilt in a Missoni style. It's a color study. It starts with like 2 colors, and then it takes 1 color from that palette and adds another color, and continues on that way down through the quilt. Here we meet the tulips again. Extraterrestrial tulips take a trip is almost entirely pieced, but it has a few of the small tulips appliqued on. There was no sketch with this one. I just started with a tulip and kept building the quilt from there. It has a lot of embroidery on it. I used a lot of different types of stitches to create dimension in the figures. And the next slide shows some of the embroidered detail. You can go on. My obsession with tulips will now be clear to you. The tulips attend a folk festival was also based on a drawing I did, this time in Procreate. And it is inspired by a Herman Miller fabric designed by Alexander Girard from 1966. The smaller circles are appliqued on, but the rest is pieced. And lastly, not a tulip, but still a botanical theme. Tropicality was inspired again by a piece of upholstery fabric. It's primarily pieced improvisationally, but has a little bit of applique for the smaller machine embroidered leaves. And the leafy plant in front was created as one piece and then partially appliqued and partially pieced into the background. I think that combining of all these different techniques, as well as my interest in botanical themes and in still life composition, is as a hallmark of my work. And I may be done with tulips, but I'm going to continue exploring these processes and themes. Next, I want to try a sculptural element, mostly because I've ran out of wall space and I need some of my quilts to stand up on their own on the floor. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Julie Hackbarth. Vermont has been my home since I came here for college. Looking back at my first quilt that I designed when I was 17, I realized how very modern, colorful, and off the grid it is, which was definitely considered unusual in Wisconsin at the time. While I understood that, I chose to take a science-related career path. When resuming quilting in 2016, I spent time learning about current quilting techniques and tools while using modern quilt patterns. Next. Rising Stars is an example of quilts I designed prior to this class. I was quite comfortable with simple repetition and uniform pieced units. I do like the colors and the tension with ground. I eventually began to find quilt makers who inspire me. Thank you, Maria, for sharing your quilt making approach through teaching and for offering this unique 6-month seminar. The content format and sharing amongst the quilt community has really helped me. I mean, the class community has really helped me get back on track with my own quilt to aesthetics. Next. Purple Solstice is my first quilt made in this class. It's inspired by the monochromatic prompt with different values of purple representing darkness. This design is very much on the grid and sketched out before cutting fabric. Next. Streaming Through Darkness is inspired by the solstice and shapes prompts. The curved circles of various colors represent a brightness streaming through the darkness of winter. I was still tied to repeating units and unsure how to proceed beyond that. The view is also inspired by the shape prompt. I explored improv piecing by making multiple units using a selected color palette. While working on layout, I had an aha moment. It was time to stop cropping units to the same size before working with them on the design wall. I modified the original blocks to vary the size and coloring. The ground placement helps each block stand out with its own unique view. Centered and Grounded is the last piece I made during this class. It was inspired by a silkscreen block print banner that hung in my mother's pottery studio. My plan was to use brightly colored, large curved circles inspired by the end of the winter and the beginning of spring. I quickly changed the layout of my original quilt, original sketch after making the 6 curved circle units. Construction was a challenge, lots of stops to ponder and make changes, many reminders to stick with it. I am very happy with the results. I like the tension with ground. I am pleasantly surprised by the similarity between this quilt and the first quilt I made way back when I was 17. Looking forward, next I'd like to work on several pieces inspired by design components of the last 2 quilts I made in this class. Installing a large design wall will surely help. I also want to continue to explore color selection and work on becoming more comfortable with uncertainty and discovery, which commonly occur during an improv design and construction process. Thank you, Michelle, and everyone in the class.
Laura, are you here?
I was reading. Sorry. Am I on now? Go
Yes.
again?
Yes.
Okay, hi. I'm Laura Hall, and I currently live in Asheville, North Carolina, but I've been living in the mountains of Southern Appalachia for about 25 years. I'm a huge fan of Appalachian culture and art. And I signed up for this class to continue to hone my skills as an improv quilter and broaden my folk art and outsider art skills. I'm a huge Maria Schell fan. She's a great teacher, a positive influence, and an encourager. And this class has moved me forward in multiple ways with style, color, and concepts. Next one. This piece is called Early Spring Crocus, and this was from my second big botany class with Maria. I used a photo I'd taken in my own yard in the late winter of 2022. I had grand plans, great sketches, lots of ideas, but I could not make them all work at the same time. So I've deconstructed, reconstructed, deconstructed, and finally reconstructed the piece into this configuration. It was a long road, but I love it. Next. The first prompt we had was called, I used Sister Corita Kent. I call this piece Love and Peace. The inspiration was her piece from 1952 called The Seat of Wisdom. I fell in love with all of her work, but this one to me sort of combined everything about her. She was full of peace, love, learning, and caring. And I fell in love with that too. Next one. This is called Tunisian. Let's see, this one is called Dance With Me. The prompt was Art Deco. I went.
Laura, you need to unmute yourself. Apologies.
Oh, where am I? Start on this one?
Yep.
Okay, this one is called Dance With Me. It's the prompt was Art Deco. I went down the Leon Baxt trail and found his costume designs for the Ballet Russes very intriguing. And I used the costume from Scheherazade as my inspiration, using shapes and colors from the costume to build this piece. Next. Chaos. The prompt was Hilma af Klint. And this work was inspired by her work. Oh, wait, never mind. Sorry. This was inspired by a work called Primordial Chaos. It went in a very opposite, wait. Oh, it's titled wrong, sorry. This is Tunisian Garden by Paul, the prompt was Paul Klee. It was inspired by many of his works. There were so many. I even ordered books to study Paul Klee, and I went down a complete rabbit hole of study on this one, but this represents his focus on expressionism, color, and flowers. Next one. Into the Woods. The prompt was location. I live in the mountains, I live in the woods, and this represents the woods, the trails, and the early spring blooms on my property in Brevard. It is my ode to spring. Next. This is a piece that I made from my location prompt that was inspired by all of the scraps from my woods piece. What didn't work, some of what did work, but was more than I needed, and any random scraps I had. I added the blue to represent sky and the creek that runs through the property. Thank you. Next one. Dance With Me. The prompt here was Art Deco. No, the prompt here was, this is the wrong title on here. It's called Chaos. The prompt was Hilma af Klint, and it was inspired by a work she did called Primordial Chaos. And if you look up that work, you'll see that it's a very subdued but beautiful piece. I went in the complete opposite color direction and called it bold right out of the box. I loved making this one. Next. And my flower block. The prompt was for our last month, it was called block print. I have a Walter Anderson block print hanging in my bedroom at home, and I love the piece. And I thought, well, what better inspiration to use than something I already own? So this was my jumping off spot, my Walter Anderson block print. And it's my smallest piece. None of them are quilted. The prompts were all very intriguing. I made choices based on what spoke to my unconscious. And during these explorations, I found myself excited, enthused, invigorated, and engaged. And yes, there were challenges, but the great reward for me was figuring out how to make the sketches, to make the attempts, and make leftovers work. It all stretched my brain, and I continue to love to create. My style of work is to research, to sketch, to make, to resketch, to remake, rip, resketch, sleep on it. It's a fluid process in my mind to keep trying. And the next step for me will be to continue to explore and learn. But the next step, really and truly, for the rest of the year is going to be spent quilting all of these pieces. And I want to thank everyone for their wonderful inspiration. And thank you, Maria.
Hi, I'm Drew Hammond, and I currently live in Santa Fe, New Mexico. I've been quilting since the 70s. Between raising kids, moving multiple times, working in an office, playing with grandkids, ranching and horsing around, there's always been a quilt in the works. I usually start a quilt with the atmosphere I want to reflect, be it joyful, calming, funny, or cozy, and then I draft on draft paper. The challenge for me in this workshop was to select a prompt that sparked my interest. The next challenge was to make that prompt into a series. The prompt I chose was the 1 block repetition without any filler units. This is the first in my series using the square and square block. Most, but not all of the fabrics are grunge. All of the tops were quilted on my domestic machine. This outcome reminded me of the tightly stacked cliff dwellings at Bandelier National Monument, hence the name Cliff Dwellings. What if I took the same blocks and made them a bit wonky? That's where this quilt came in. I really enjoyed making this piece, but it definitely took more time going wonky. Here you see the cliff dwellings side by side. It's interesting to see how differently your eye moves around each quilt. Continuing the series, I focused on a single block. What if I played inside the squares? This quilt didn't get quilted yet. Sometimes we had an artist as a prompt, as you've heard. Andy Warhol was the prompt for this series number 4. And yes, I did use rulers. With the suggestion of a guest speaker, Michael Ross, I quilted this with Superior Threads mono poly thread, and I really liked the effect that it made. I didn't use rulers in this one. I loved playing around with remaining scraps from all the other projects. I really wanted to put green in there, but it just never wanted to be there. This top was on my design wall for a very long time, getting tweaked daily. Am I finished with square and square? Probably not. I really like this design. I like the flexibility of it, and I'll probably be playing with it again. Seeing what happens when you sketch your thinking around a traditional block has really inspired me to continue to play and explore. I'm always asking myself, what if? Thank you, Maria and Elizabeth and the fellow students for keeping the 6-month adventure going.
Hi, my name is Janice Marshall, and I live in Seattle, Washington. I took Maria's class to improve my technical skills and to explore my version of improv. I approached this class by going back to the basic elements of design. And I discovered that once I focused on one element at a time, it forced me to open up design possibilities I didn't consider before. Next slide. No Directions Given is a pre-class piece I made after taking Zoom classes with Sherry Linwood and Tara Fana. I applied the process of giving myself a rule for this project. The rule I gave myself was that I could only use scraps I'd been collecting from previous projects to make the colored squares. I made 130 squares. And when I finished making the piece, I discovered that it reads like the Sunday comics, bright and then dark. Next slide. Colors and Bubbles is the first piece I made in class. The elements I focused on this one was organic lines. I applied applique circles to give it the floating bubble effect to the grid work of the lines. I decided to challenge myself by learning how to do inset circles in a future piece. And I want to thank Gail for giving us instructions on how to do that. Next slide. So circles and rocks was the answer to mastering inset circles. The challenge I gave myself was to make them in as many ways as I could. I discovered some of the shapes are easier to inset than others. Practicing is a good thing to do. Next slide. Flying jeans makes me smile. The element I focused on was flying geese. My previous geese, I always paper pieced, but I no longer need to do that. Some of my geese are skinny and wonky, and some are on the heavy side. I like how the thin black line emphasizes the wonky shape of the geese. Next slide. Yellow and Blue Leaves focuses on the arc shape. I discovered playing with the arc shape It easily makes flowers and leaves shapes. I applied the thin blue line lesson again to the arcs, and this strengthens the leaves, makes the leaves stand out. This piece is bright and sunny. I plan on continuing work in my basic element series. I can see a piece in quarters, circles, half circles, squares, triangles. There are many possibilities. I will also be taking a class with Irene Roderick this summer. I look forward to that. And I'll be taking a class with Maria Botany in the fall. Thank you, girls, for a wonderful class. And thank you, Maria and Elizabeth. It was fun.
Hi there, I'm Michelle. I'm a professional long-arm quilter and I live in Southeast Australia. I've been quilting about 20 years, but this is the first step I've taken into improv quilting. Next. This was my first improv quilt. I attended a workshop with Irene Roderick last November, and this was the result. In making this quilt, I discovered that I really enjoyed the process of improv piecing. This quilt includes a lot of shapes as well as techniques that were new to me. I had plenty of fun trying to make it into a cohesive composition. I'm not quite sure how successful that was, but we all start somewhere. After making this first improv quilt and wanting to do more, I joined this Stitching Towards Discovery class. Next. This quilt is cells. The prompt I used for this quilt was monochrome. As my career background is in medical research, I wanted to see if I could make quilts depicting biological themes. This quilt represents generalized human cells as seen through a microscope. For me, the quilting is important. The detailed freehand quilting here represents the massive surface area interfaces where life-giving biochemical interactions occur. The piecing was complex and I learned a lot making this quilt, and I really enjoyed the challenge of it. Next. Continuing the biological theme, I made this quilt to represent insulin. Insulin is an essential hormone comprising two peptide strands joined together. Dysregulation of insulin in the body results in diabetes. The cartoon-like bold simplicity of this quilt is appealing to me. Each square of the color represents a specific amino acid in an accurate representation of the protein sequences of insulin. Fitting the two chains separately into a grid and connecting them where appropriate was quite the task. My aim for this quilt was to open discussion and provide an opportunity to educate about diabetes, which is a massive medical and social issue related to insulin. Next. Another quilt with a scientific approach is this one. A null hypothesis claims that no relationship exists between two variables. It forms the premise of almost all experiments. This quilt explores the relationships between variable colors. In my first real experimentation with colors, this quilt like it is setting a foundation of color in my imaging. This quilt has inspired me to spend much more time exploring color, which I have felt somewhat afraid of doing before. I'm excited to take this idea and keep playing with it. Next. As a result of taking this Stitching Towards Discovery class is that I have gained confidence with my work and become brave enough to show and share it in a public platform. This quilt, Ebb and Flow, was made to enter the curated In Conversation exhibition. This exhibition of international quilt artists is currently showing in Sydney before it travels to Melbourne and onto other venues in Australia. This quilt depicts the ebb and flow of conversation that is sometimes back and forth on a single topic and sometimes covers a whole range of ideas. I'm grateful to both Maria and my amazing classmates for their support and encouragement during this class. Moving forward, I will be continuing my improv quilting journey and working towards constructing a more substantial body of work. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Linda. I'm a visual artist who recently took up quilt making after returning home to Northeast Ohio. I had previously lived and worked in Baltimore, Maryland as an art education art educator, and visual art program supervisor in a large school system. My art practice focused on found, natural, and repurposed materials. I returned to the Cleveland area after I retired from teaching, and now I live with and care for my aging mother. This has given me the opportunity to dedicate more time and energy to my practice as an artist. My mother made quilts when I was growing up. I still have a 9-patch she made for me when I went to college in 1982. Shifting my practice to focus on quilt making provides me with opportunities to connect with my mom because I am a hand quilter and I'm able to sit with her in the evenings and stitch while she reads or watches TV. This quilt is called Quilt Room Camo because it reminds me both of camouflage and the piles of scraps that remain in my studio after finishing a quilt. And this was actually made from scraps from another quilt. The quilt making work I do is in cotton fabric is improvisational and based on colors, shapes, and patterns that I relate to specific places. My mother's backyard garden, a forest on the coast of Maine, or the Lake Erie shoreline, for example. This one named Street Grids relates to the very ordered design of the suburban streets where I now live. I continue to develop my technical skills and I'm beginning to find a design process that works for me. I have more success when I begin with just a sliver of an idea, which may come from an idea about a place, a color palette, or a shape. I let that develop on its own through experimentation, trial and error, lots of moving things around on the design wall. I try not to have a preconceived idea about how a finished quilt will look. This one is called Deer Isle Forest, and it started with a color palette that I chose from photos I took while on Deer Isle in the coast of Maine. I've recently become enamored with the colorful piles of discarded grocery, newspaper, and retail store bags I found collecting in my relatives' garages and in bins at local strip malls. I saw an opportunity to connect my previous work repurposing materials to my work with fiber, and I've added this plastic to my artistic dialogue, focusing on the colors as well as the patterns and shapes created by text and logo designs printed on the bags. I laminate the plastic using heat to combine about 4 layers of plastic into one sheet that kind of resembles Tyvek. When working with plastic, I draw from the tradition of quilts of Amish communities of Holmes County, Ohio, not too far from where I currently live. I'm inspired to take traditional patterns, play with the non-traditional material that is not in any way connected to Amish tradition, and create something that provides a viewer with a commentary about the modern world. I sometimes experiment with improvisational techniques in plastic, but I'm limited by the properties of the plastic. Seams have to be straight. Plastic can't be ironed once it's fused. The printed text and the logos on the bag sometimes provide opportunities to add another layer to the design. This quilt, titled Thank You for Shopping, will be included in the Ohio Arts Council 2023 biennial exhibition. I've been experimenting with the possibilities of the logo from Target bags. I found that cutting up the logo into segments can create a lot of range. This one combines Target bags with black shopping bags. Because the process of lamination isn't perfectly controlled, it involves some amount of shrinking, and the bags are often slightly different in scale and shape, which gives it a little bit of a wonkiness. This, and there's an example of one of the bags. This series of 3 Target bag quilts show more of the possibilities of reconstructing that ubiquitous Target logo. I used laminated plastic to back each quilt and used batting that's made of recycled plastic bottles for the interior. These haven't been quilted yet, but I plan to use that original Target logo as the design for the hand stitching. From here forward, I hope to find possibilities to exhibit my work, both the plastic and the more traditional cotton quilts. I'm in the process of expanding my studio space so I can actually have a separate space for quilt making and painting. Thank you to Maria and Elizabeth for all the ideas, sharing personal experiences, and for all the feedback. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Barb Searing. I'm a native New Yorker, a huge Yankees fan, and a grandmother to 6 beautiful grandchildren. Currently, I live in Dehinda, Illinois, and one fun fact is I have lived in 5 different states and have lived in one of those states twice. Also, I'm a quilter whose mission is to inspire and bring joy to those who are interested in the quilting arts. My vision is to continue to learn new approaches in the quilting field and make others aware of these different techniques. Therefore, I want to continue to create quilts to share with others as well as enter in exhibits. I have been able to do this despite a debilitating autoimmune disease. I would like to share my journey in Stitch Toward Discovery class with you. The decision to take this class started with next. An adventure begins with the first step. It was prompted by my thoughts. Where am I going with my quilting? What is my next step? Finally, how do I convey these thoughts in fabric? The result was a staircase leading towards the future. There are 2 reasons why I love this quilt. First, this was the first of my quilts to travel and be viewed by many people across the United States. Second, when I look at this quilt, it reminds me not to fear the next first step. What's your next step? Mine was deciding to take the Stitch Toward Discovery class and create these quilts. Next. Not squared came from the prompt labeled shape. I selected the rectangle because I like symmetry. A challenge in this design was creating a mini-sized rectangle to form the center medallion. Incorporating bright colors and Dr. Seuss fabric, I successfully created a playful quilt to be enjoyed by young and old alike. Next. Summer Sky came from the prompt labeled Solstice. I selected summer because of the combination of warm and cool colors. Using design software, Summer Sky taught me the importance of what color placement can do for a project. This quilt was paper pieced. Once sewn, I saw the summer sun beating in the sky. Do you feel it too? Next. Playing with geometry came from the prompt labeled Bauhaus. This design is described as abstract, angular, and geometric with a little flair. The biggest challenge was creating a pleasing layout. The best part was seeing the results. The color placement highlights the blocks within the piece. Also, it draws the viewer in to enjoy the improv lines within the geometric shapes. Next. Shifted came from the prompt labeled grid. Using design software, I drew a grid and simply shifted it around. This is a picture of shifted. The challenge with this was the color palette. I wanted the correct combination of bright colors to capture a person's attention. Recently, I gathered all these fabrics and am eager to start piecing it together. In the process of designing and creating these quilts, I learned time management is not my strength. I have decided to I've been described as a perfectionist. I describe myself as being very thoughtful in all my decisions when it comes to my work. Therefore, time flies before I know it. I will not proceed if the project doesn't feel right. The most successful part of my work will be when these quilts and others I have created are seen by the community. If one person gets the spark to create something beautiful to them, or they receive joy just from viewing my work, then I feel it's a win for both of us. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you, Maria and Elizabeth, for a great class experience, and go Yankees.
Excuse me while I get that thing off my screen. Hi, everyone. I'm Judy Shelton. I live in Boynton Beach, Florida. And One of my trademarks is my quirky and whimsical, whimsical sense of humor, as you can see by the two pictures on the side, and you might recognize another person in the bottom right picture who actually took that picture. I maintained my sense of humor after I retired from 35 years teaching and being a guidance counselor in a middle school. I still have my sense of humor, but next slide. I also have difficulty focusing on anything. So that was when I created about 10 years ago. I don't know whether I'm coming or going, or it could be titled Everything Everywhere All at Once, because I get all these ideas and I just don't know exactly where to go with them. And as a result of that, I have taken many classes and begun many projects and accumulated many UFOs. And I took Stitching Toward Discovery with Maria because I needed help becoming focused, taking my art seriously, and proceeding from there. And I knew from taking many classes with Maria that she would be a great one to guide me and prod me. Next. So not all of these were created in class, because one of my focuses became, let me work on the many UFOs I have accumulated and get those done, because I wanted to just do it. The piece on the top left-hand corner, this started in Nancy Crow's stitching, strip piecing and reconstruction. Started out on the top left with huge pieces of, huge strips of fabrics. Proceeded to the right with a design that I was really liking the way it looked, but Nancy kept coming over and saying, no, you have to keep cutting up, you're reconstructing. And that resulted in the piece you see, Urban Chaos, which is a small piece. Nancy likes big pieces, but I wanted to get it done. And I found out what I discovered is that I really like cutting it up and sewing it back together and cutting it up some more. Even though it was kind of hard working with teeny tiny pieces, I really did enjoy that process. And I then matched it, quilted it. And by the way, with all of these quilts, no rulers were used or harmed in the process. I just want to make that clear. Around and Around is a piece I made in Maria's, oh boy, Maria, I can't think of the name of it, Making Prints from Solids. And it's not quilted or finished quite yet, but it is ready to be quilted. And in this process, I started with all the units and all the bits that we created from our color palette that we had selected. And then I was confronted with a design wall with all of that on it. And that was a little problematic for me, as I discovered, because I found that I need to have some kind of a sketch or a plan, and that's more my comfort level. I was fine with the very center, which is obviously a wonky log cabin, but after that, I kind of dwelt on how to put it all together, but I did it. Fanta City is a piece that I made at the same time that I was taking this class with Maria. I was taking a class with Rosalie Dace on Friedrich Hundertwasser, the artist, and I was taken with his use of spirals, buildings, and windows. And I kind of cheated, but it was so much fun to grab the fabrics that I felt demonstrated or intimated windows, and I pieced those together, and then I appliqued them on top of the wonderful background fabric that's a Cafe facet print. And I've just begun quilting it. The strayed threads there are because I haven't buried those threads yet. But what I also discovered with this piece, I experimented with monopoly on the needle and the bobbin. And it worked great for the buildings because I didn't want to compromise the windows. So that leads me to this piece. This is the culmination of a class with Nancy Crow on line, shape, circles, curves. And I put this one, this was before it was finished, to give you an idea of the size. It's 80 by 80. And I don't know if I'll ever do another quilt that big, but I am so proud of myself that I actually got this done, because that was a major focus to work on in this class. So here is the completed top. It's not quilted yet, hence all those lovely wrinkles. The top right was the first one I did. The bottom right is inspired by Kandinsky and his love of these snaky, narrow, snaky lines. And if I tell you that was the hardest thing to put together, it was. And then to the left bottom is inspired by Kandinsky and spirals around the eyes, and then the film strip looking things using representing the windows he uses. And then the top left was the last one I did, and I love that one the best. And I've come to accept the fact that when you're doing circles and curves, things don't always match up the way you intended them to, and that's perfectly fine. So I included this one here because I was done with a 2-week class with Nancy Crow and having margaritas and such. And I was so excited and so happy that I forgot to take my name tag off. And I wondered through the whole meal, how come the waiter knew my name? That explains it. So cheers to everyone. And from this point, Maria, you helped me become so focused that I so appreciate it. I have now become in the habit of spending quality time in my studio. I no longer question myself, but I trust myself to make decisions that will give me the results I want. And what I want to work on next will be the many sketches I have. I would like to take them from the sketchbook to fabric and see where that takes me. Thank you, Maria and Elizabeth. It's been a wonderful experience. Cheers to everyone.
Hi, everybody. My name is Lisa Smith, and I'm presenting to you from Garrett Park, Maryland, which is a small town just outside of Washington, D.C. I've been a traditional quilter for many years, but have recently turned my interest towards modern, improv, and art quilting. Maria's class has helped me to explore my individual style and get more courageous with improv design. And it has been incredibly freeing to put away other people's patterns and see what I can do on my own. I've just seen the tip of the iceberg with that, and I look forward to continuing exploration.
Nice try, Lou.
Next. This first quilt is called Winter Solstice, and it was in response to an early prompt that Maria gave us. It is the first quilt that I've ever made as an improv design. I fell in love with curve piecing and circles, and you will see that carrying through the rest of the quilts that I made these past 6 months. I also love the blue and orange color combination, as well as the use of pattern fabrics. I found that pattern fabric was generally difficult to work with on improv quilts for fear of running out of what I needed, but this quilt came together nicely with what I had on hand. Next. The second quilt was less successful for me, but at the same time, it presented opportunities and challenges that I think I will continue to explore in the future. The challenge was to take one block and repeat it in different variations to see what I could come up with. Each motif is essentially a drunkard's path block, which I stretched and turned and manipulated to see what different designs I could get. My husband named this quilt the Winchester Mystery Quilt because it reminded him of the odd house built by the heir of the Winchester fortune, where staircases are built to nowhere and rooms have no direction or purpose. And that's kind of what this quilt does. But I think it gives me a lot of ideas to continue with in the future. And I think I see this quilt as the first in a series that I would like to work on. Next. This is a quilt I made in Maria's Circle and Curves class, which I took in conjunction with Stitching Towards Discovery. Mainly, I wanted to see what more mysteries of curved piecing I could uncover because I was having so much fun with them. It was great to experiment with different types of curved piecing and decide how I can incorporate them into my work. It was a quilt where I felt I could just have fun making separate elements, and I didn't really care whether or not they made it into a finished quilt. The individual components were just fun to make. Next. Obviously, my love affair of circles and curves and improv piecing continued with this quilt. It's not a particularly original design, but I just loved it and I enjoyed making it. I love the colors and I got a lot of satisfaction out of piecing and quilting it. It was just an itch I really wanted to scratch. Next. I call this quilt Lollipop Lollipop because of the pinky, purple, candy-like colors, as well as the improv circles that are incorporated into it. I made this quilt after we had Irene Roderick as the guest speaker. I loved her approach to improv design and the making of elements and what she calls dancing with the wall. It's the process of making elements and putting them up on the design wall and moving them around until they work together and speak to each other and tell you what they need. I challenged myself to make this quilt without having any starting idea and just let it grow from the first improv circle that I made. I learned a lot about balancing elements and being willing to let go of the pieces that didn't work. And this was definitely a process that I want to continue and explore as I design my future work. Next. Lastly, this quilt was one of my most difficult ones. And even though it was not one of my more successful designs, I found that the piecing was a huge challenge. I had a vision in my head of what I wanted, and it was frustrating not to be able to get the quilt to look like what I wanted in my head. Or even the sketches that I had put down on paper. I had to accept that I shouldn't expect it to get it right the first time. I realized that I can learn more from my challenges than I do from my successes. And then even if I don't finish this quilt, it'll be a jumping off point for more challenges down the road. I think my next challenge will be to make a series of quilts. It'll be good for me to go deep into the weeds of designing quilts in a series based on a theme and taking a slower approach so that I can thoroughly explore where my work can take me. I'm just getting started, and I really want to thank Maria and Elizabeth for this opportunity. Thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Robin Thomas, and I currently live in Morrisville, North Carolina. I started this class struggling with the line between craftsman and artist. Quilting has always been a craft for me as I learned to stitch on the knees of those prominent women of my childhood. But during this journey with this amazing group of quilters, I discovered I will always be a craftsman, but I am also an artist. Next. The wind is invisible and cannot be seen directly, but through those things it touches. I lived in the Midwest most of my life, and it's common to see wind turbines and fence rows. Shadows of the wind lets you glimpse the wind by viewing the shadows it creates across the fields by moving the wind turbine blades. Next. I am a modern traditional quilter. I love to take a traditional quilt pattern and twist it just a bit. Star Bright, Star Not Quite Right is one of those quilts. I was learning to construct the blades of a Lone Star quilt to better understand how to handle all those stretchy diagonals and still get clean points. But I didn't like the single star layout, so I spun the blades into many stars. I then quilted in yet another traditional star pattern just for fun. If I was a quilt, what would I look like? Nothing too fussy or intricate, bold but muted colors used to make statements, an overall feeling of peace and calm, lots of sharp angles and a little whimsy thrown in. It's hip to be square, it's just that, me in quilt form. We were given the inspirational prompt of winter solstice, and I knew exactly the moment I wanted to capture. It was a week before Christmas, and I was driving home on a stretch of I-40 where basically you see up a hill. All you could see were headlights and taillights weaving in the darkness, and it was a bit unnerving. Winter's commute may not truly be about the solstice, but it captures the feeling of that December commute. Math is a universal language. The upside down capital A means for all in math. This quilt has 112 for all symbols, each in a different size and color, with 7 background colors to represent all of us living in this world together. One for all was jurred into the No Boundaries exhibit at the Virginia Quilt Museum this summer. In researching Paul Klee, I found inspiration in a color exercise he had drawn in a notebook, using just lines to explore color behavior. I used fine lines in varying lengths to create a repetitive pattern in 2 colorways I don't typically use. The final product moves your eye in a way that is a bit mesmerizing. I took those same colors from mesmerizing and applied them to the idea of railroad spikes on an unconventional grid. All right, celebration didn't turn out looking like railroad spikes, but more like confetti. I will be continuing to work with this idea of confetti on a non-traditional grid. Okay, it just won't be railroad spikes any longer. Next. I work for an agricultural chemical company that is innovative and always out to try something new. This can lead to projects that just don't quite turn out like they're supposed to. Using a Bauhaus design style of morphing one shape into another, I tackled this project not knowing where it was truly headed. Building airplanes in the air is a favorite saying around the office for just such occasions. This quote commemorates the idea of innovation. More innovation will be coming. Cars, boats, tractors, who knows what else. Sunbeams come out of nowhere and change the way something is viewed. Inspired by a graphic in a Delta Airlines safety video, Into the Light explores what happens when you view items through a sunbeam. This quilt was the most difficult to make, although it had the fewest pieces. My minimalist style was stretched to its limit, as each piece held considerably more importance than I realized going in. I foresee many more sunbeams in my future. I want to thank Maria and all the other quilters for allowing me to find my voice, which is considerably more minimalist than most of them. It was a mind-opening experience, and I'm not giving up my rulers. So thank you all.
Hello, I am going to be reading the presentations for the next 2 presenters. And this is Liz. So she has written this and I am reading it. My name is Liz Waters. I live on Bainbridge Island, Washington, and I'm flying across the country today. So Maria is going to read my presentation. I enrolled in Stitching Toward Discovery with several goals in mind. I wanted to establish a regular studio practice and increase my output of creative work. I wanted the motivation and inspiration of regular meetings and featured speakers without the constraints of a formal class focused on a particular skill or aesthetic. I didn't have a plan for what to create in the workshop, but I know that I am drawn to representational images, to bold colors, and to the joy and challenge of piecing. In our first month, I responded to the monochromatic prompt after seeing an old building in Vietnam with shutters and mullions painted in a range of unusual blues. The windows and shutters were created first without reliance on rulers, while the brick and mortar were pieced next using very uniform blocks and strips. Combining the two was challenging for me. In fact, the challenge of combining highly structured units with more improvisational piecing became an unintentional theme for me during this workshop. I decided to stick with architectural elements for my next quilt. I found this photo of a spiral staircase and I wanted to recreate it in fabric. I had never done foundation paper piecing before, but after some initial head scratching, I created an FPP pattern for this photograph and created 2 quilts in complementary colorways. Stairs to the right was done in pink and green, and stairs to the left was done in orange and blue. Both of these quilts were approximately 24 inches square. I say were because while they allowed me to learn the basics of foundation paper piecing, the final results were too static for me. I decided to cut the quilt tops up, recombine the pieces, and add new elements. The result is Ode to Escher. It may make some people dizzy, but it makes me happier than the original 2 quilts. It is the only piece that I managed to quilt during the workshop. Next, I began manipulating my foundation paper piece pattern to see if I could use it to convey an image or concept other than stairs. I created the paper pieced elements first, and then I decided on the layout and pieced them together. Again, combining highly structured units into an improvisational layout was quite challenging, particularly as I ripped out paper piece seams and reconstructed them with new fabric to achieve the illusion of the mechanical leaves overlapping. My final quilt is called Journey. This image came to me when I happened to turn several piece steps on their sides and was suddenly reminded of a tall, imposing wall. I am still figuring out where I'm going on this quilting journey of mine. In terms of my goals, I did create much more work over these past 5 months than I would have otherwise. I taught myself new skills and worked through technical piecing challenges with success. However, I have not yet established a consistent studio practice that works with my other commitments. I finished these pieces by committing long hours on weekends with large gaps of time in between studio sessions. Fostering a daily studio practice remains a primary goal of mine. While still elusive, thanks to our workshop speakers, I now have more tools and role models to help me get there. In terms of my creative vision, I'm very excited by the idea of utilizing architectural elements and belt structures to inspire my quilted works. I plan to stay focused on this for the time being and have many ideas and images swirling in my head. Many thanks to Maria, our speakers, and all my fellow participants for an inspiring and productive 5 months. My name is Kathy Falconer. I am from Anchorage, Alaska. I enrolled in Stitching Towards Discovery to add structure and discipline to my quilt making. The class helped me set monthly goals and to establish a sewing schedule in my daily routine. Without the class, I would not have given myself that dedicated time to create. The class gave me permission to put quilting ahead of other tasks in my life. Improv patchwork is like getting to make your own puzzle. You are the designer and also the player. It's about having a very flexible attitude toward the design process and allows a looser hold on the rulers and expectations. As a maker, I wanted to stop following the patterns of others and create quilts of my own design. It's thrilling to know there is no other quilt like yours on the planet. I've always wanted to piece some Alaskan animals, and halibut was high on my list. In Maria's Under the Influence class, I took the leap to figure out how to create my idea using patchwork. I learned to choose techniques from my tool belt to piece the subject of my choice. There was some trial and error going on here as I experimented with different techniques. What a blast it was to let chance determine block design, scale, and color choices in Maria's Game of Improv workshop. The real work for me was creating a composition with all those unrelated units. This quilt is a celebration of color, shape, and pattern. To grid or not, in most of my quilts today, you will find an underlying grid as the foundation. I discovered that I really like a grid to hold my blocks in place, but grids can be flexible, like this offset one to accommodate different size log cabin blocks. Am I going next level? So many of us in this class wanted to push the boundaries and grow as artists in the quilt making world. I was inspired to make some sewn sketches in just 2 colors to explore line and shape. Can I combine my sketches to make a pleasing composition? Although I was happy with my sketches, I struggled to find harmony in the grouping. It took many attempts, discards, and modifications to create this quilt. Being dismayed, I put it aside for a while. After getting some support from the Stitching Toward Discovery team at a Zoom workshop, I persevered and powered on. It required lots of tweaking to create a balance between the figure lines and the background. In all, it took about 8 weeks to complete this, my most challenging quilt top. Sometime in those 8 weeks of pushing myself in uncomfortable ways, I gave my permission to take a break. I gave myself a permission to take a break and return to playing with color. Using scraps from Color Brick Road, I let myself relax and create a small, simple piece with a design familiar and comfortable. I didn't let this piece get away from me in size or complexity. I thoroughly enjoyed piecing these blocks and felt so satisfied to complete it in just a few days. This quilt is in response to the prompt place. It is also a response from our guest lecturer on creative stamina, Jane Dunwald. She says that what you love and what you create need to be aligned for you to find joy in the making. I love cross-country skiing. In February, I participated in the American Birkebeiner 55-kilometer ski race in Wisconsin. I apologize if I pronounced that wrong. This quilt is an elevation map made to scale of the race course. Each panel between the color bars represents 2 kilometers of distance. An inch of height on the quilt is equal to 20 meters of elevation gain. As I pieced this quilt, memories flooded me, both of the course itself and how I felt both mentally and physically as the race progressed. It is a deeply personal piece. Jane was right. I loved creating a quilt that represents a real joy in my life. For my next steps as a quilter, I would like to get back to my improv pieced book cover BOM, Block of the Month project called Patchwork and Prose. There will most likely be more Alaskan animals in my quilty future as well. Thank you for letting me share my work with all of you today. And that brings us to the final slide. I'm going to just hit play on this because it's fun. Thank you all very much for participating in and attending the Big Tada 2023. I hope that you enjoyed the presentations as much as I did, and know that if you would like to look at this presentation again, there will be a recording of it on YouTube, and we will put a link on my Instagram feed, which is at Maria Shell Quilts. And you can go to my profile and click on the link to watch it again. And yeah, I'm gonna hit this again. Whoops. No, I wanted to play that again one more time. I will stop that and I'll just go here and we can say our goodbyes. All right, thank you all.